So the short version of Amanda's book is that after a period of working as a traveler and a journalist around the world, she ended up being a captive in Somalia by a team of boys, essentially, boys and young men for 15 months. Went through all sorts of almost unimaginable rigors and hardship. And through the period of that time, as is known, she converted to Islam as part of her survival strategy. She dealt with great rigors. And she has come out in a place where one might not necessarily expect somebody who'd been through such hardship to come out, and she'll describe all that to us. But let's begin. Tell us the early part of your story. Your childhood is part of and your family background is part of why you ended up in Somalia. So set the stage of what kind of person you are and why you ended up in this setting.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. It's just wonderful to be here. Growing up, traveling was not something that my family did. We didn't have money for that. My mother, she was a cashier at a grocery store. So the world to me was the images that I saw on the pages of National Geographic magazine. I kept a great big stack of them beside my bed. My older brother and I, after school, we used to go down back alleys looking for garbage dumpsters, which we'd hop into looking for empty bottles that we could take into the bottle depot and get a couple of coins. And I would buy those back issue copies of National Geographic. So the world outside of this small agricultural city that I grew up in central Alberta, Canada, it beckoned me from a really young age.
And your family, were there things about your family that made you want to get out and see the world in addition to just this National Geographic introduction?
Yeah, my parents split up when I was 6 years old, and I grew up with my mom and her boyfriends, many of whom were very abusive. So you could say that I escaped really into those magazines and this idea that the world out there somewhere was this exotic and beautiful and colorful place, very different than what I was experiencing as a child.
So tell us about some of the tamer earlier parts of your travel. You hadn't yet become a working journalist. You're going to places that were somewhat less dangerous than you ended up. Where did you go when you first left Alberta?
So when I finished high school, university didn't really seem like much of an option for me, considering my family's financial situation. So I moved to the big city, which for me was the city of Calgary. And I started working. I saved up all of my money so I could buy my first plane ticket outside of North America, and this was to Venezuela. And I took a 6-week trip there, which was really all the affirmation for me that I needed that the world was an accessible place. And so for the next 7 years, I traveled all over. I went to over 50 countries, usually alone with a backpack on. I was always on a shoestring budget. I was learning how to get by on $20 a day in places like India. And I was really discovering myself as I was crossing borders and pushing limits.
In your book, you mentioned something that you gave a name to something I've often experienced but hadn't thought of in just the name, the rule of proximity. Do you remember that well enough to explain to the audience? Which is, when you get to each place, the main thing you want is to go to the next one. You get to Peninsular Malaysia and you want to go to Indonesia. You get to Java and you want to go to the next island. So tell us about how the rule of proximity worked in your travels.
Well, I guess I can lay out an example of how it worked. I remember once being in India, and India was one of the first countries that I ventured to as a young woman by myself with a backpack, and I was meeting all of these people, other backpackers who had just come from Pakistan. And they would talk about what a beautiful country Pakistan was, very different than what we read about in the headlines. And this is the sort of rule of proximity that was intriguing to me. There was always something just on the other side of the border, and I was intrigued to go and actually have the experience to see what that really was. And so I did cross the border and go into Pakistan and discovered what those people were saying about Pakistan was true. To this day, actually, when people ask me where my favorite country is, I say it's Pakistan. It's beautiful. The people there are so hospitable and friendly, but you wouldn't know that just reading a newspaper, would you?
Correct. So in the first 1/3 or so of your book, you're essentially setting your early life story as somebody who had the adventure bug for various reasons early on. You've gone to many continents, and you've had experiences that were mixed, good and bad, but nothing had been. What was the first sort of really dark experience you had before we get to Somalia?
Well, surprisingly, considering all of the countries I went to as an adventurer by myself, I had actually very few dark experiences as I would a dark, I mean, as I would think of a dark experience. But I was robbed at gunpoint at one point in Afghanistan. But you know, other than having a gun pressed up against my back, was otherwise unharmed. I did have an experience in Bangladesh with a rickshaw driver who appeared to be trying to take me to a destination other than where I wanted to go. But
you won that showdown, right?
I did. After a blow to his head, he decided to turn his rickshaw around and take me to where I was going. So there had been a couple of instances where, you know, I had come up against something that was fearful to me, but nothing bad, nothing really bad anyways, had really happened to me until 2008.
This is a housekeeping note. If whoever's in charge of the room music could turn the music down, I think that would help all of us. So now we're shifting from this first third of the book, the sort of development of your life as world traveler, periodically going back to Canada to earn some money so you could go out on another wave, meeting people along the way. You decide to get into journalism. So how did that? Tell us about that and how that led you to Iraq.
So in 2004, I was in Africa for the first time, and I met this Australian photographer named Nigel Brennan at this one-star hotel in Ethiopia. And Nigel and I struck up a friendship, and what he was doing really inspired me because he was doing what I was. He was having his fun and adventures around the world, but he was sharing the people's stories that he was meeting with his community back at home as a journalist. And when I went back home to Calgary at the end of that trip, I couldn't stop thinking about that because as a young woman, I had often asked myself how I could make some sort of a difference in the world. And I thought maybe that was the answer, sharing people's stories. And so I bought myself an expensive camera, and I took some photography classes, and I bought another plane ticket, and this time it was to Afghanistan, and I had been to Afghanistan before. And I was bound and determined to try to make it as a freelance journalist. So I mean, I was young and I was really ambitious, but I did not have any experience. I was not especially trained. So it was hard going for me, but I also sort of felt like for the first time in my life what I was doing mattered, and I really liked that.
And in Afghanistan and also in Baghdad, in Iraq, those are places where there's tremendous warfare. The journalistic cadre was turning over. There were some hardened professionals there. There were new people. What was your experience and how you were able to sort of invent yourself as a journalist? What kinds of stories were you able to find? How did you get along with the career press corps? Well,
anybody that's read the book knows that was a really particularly challenging period for me. I wasn't exactly the norm in that group of experienced war correspondents. I did not have a university degree. I was really self-taught. I was teaching myself as I was going, so I found it really hard to build relationships in Iraq with my colleagues. But I was learning, and I was starting to have small successes as I was going. And though I was very engaged in the story in Iraq, it was also in 2008 that I was also really looking at what other stories in the world I felt like needed to be told and were underreported, and that's where my sights landed on Somalia.
Yes, and so now there are many other threads in your background we could pursue, but we probably should get to the dramatic heart of the story in Somalia. So tell us about how you decided to go there, what you hoped to see there, and what perils ahead of time you anticipated.
So I did spend a lot of time researching Somalia, and I was intrigued by this country, which has been really broken apart by over 2 decades of constant war. It's often referred to in the media as the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. And I wanted to go to tell a very specific story out of an internally displaced people's camp, which was being run by this remarkable Somali woman named Dr. Hawa Abdi. I wanted to go there. I wanted to interview her. I wanted to share her story. And so I traveled to Kenya and began making preparations for what I thought was going to be a 1-week work trip into Somalia. When at sort of the last minute, I got an email from my old friend, Nigel Brennan, the Australian photographer, and I invited him to join me on this trip, and he accepted. And so it was together that we boarded this small plane bound for what we thought was going to be a 7-day trip. We thought we were going to go, we were going to get this story, we'd come back, we'd have a holiday on one of Kenya's white sand beaches. That was our plan anyway.
And so, again, this is not really a spoiler, but you now know that the business of capturing people for money, you know it's a very widespread business, and you talk about that in your book. Did you know ahead of time this was one of the prospects you might face in Somalia?
I did, sure. I mean, I had been living in Baghdad for about 7 months at that point, and where also kidnapping is certainly a reality in that part of the world as well. So I did understand as well things like that the government of my country, of Canada, does not pay ransoms. I did know that. I would say I went into Somalia with a lot of information.
So tell us now, for those who have not read the book, and even for those who have, because it's different hearing these things in person, tell us about the day in which things went from the 7-day stay in Somalia to the 15-month stay in Somalia, of what happened that you came into captivity.
So it was August 23rd. 2008, and it was our 3rd day in the country. So that morning, Nigel and I, we woke up, we had our breakfast, we got into the SUV vehicle that we had rented, and we were going finally to this internally displaced people's camp that we had come all the way into Somalia to see. But to get to this camp, we had to leave the, you could say, relative safety of the capital city, Mogadishu. I say relative safety because there are African Union troops stationed within the city limits. But we got onto a highway road, and as we were driving along, I could see this car pulled over off to the side up ahead. And as we got closer, what unfolded was like a movie. About a dozen armed men emerged from where they'd been hiding behind that vehicle. All of them were holding AK-47s. All of their faces were completely wrapped up in these checkered scarves with only their eyes showing. So our vehicle was forced to stop. Our doors were pulled open. We were pulled out. And then the next thing I knew, I found myself lying face down on the dirt, spread eagle, with a gun held to the back of my head.
I'm going to have a couple of procedural notes here. You say it was almost in a movie. It's worth noting that your story has been optioned for a movie. And would you tell us who's cast as you?
Yeah, Rooney Mara. She's best known for her role in Girl with the Dragon Tattoo,
Yes.
which she was fabulous in.
We were, I won't go into it, the other castings we were discussing possibly yesterday. And also, as a procedural note, before we go further in the story, I mentioned to you yesterday, one of the things that makes your book so gripping is that so detailed in terms of conversations, scenes, all the other just novelistic chronicles. How did you keep such a detailed record? Starting back to your childhood, your travels through the different parts of the world, how were you able to call up all those details?
Well, I have kept journals throughout my entire life, and so they were very valuable resource for my co-author and I. As well as that period that I had in captivity, I spent so much of it in my memory that I, during that time in captivity, relived so much of my life in my mind that then coming out on the other side and sitting down actually to work with Sarah Corbett on putting this story together, a lot of that was fresher than you would imagine it to be. Yeah.
So back to the scene. You suddenly are pulled over by a group of men. Tell us what was going through your mind as you're there, spread-eagled on the ground.
I think in that moment, I thought it was a robbery. At least that's what I was hoping it was. But when we were put back into the vehicle that we had come in and we drove off now with one of our abductors at the wheel, there was some confusion really about what was happening. It was only when they brought us to this sort of abandoned house and they put Nigel and I together inside a room and we waited for somebody to explain what was happening to us when one of the leaders of this thing finally turned up. And he was a young guy in his mid-20s, maybe a Somali guy who seemed like he had an education, who had traveled around the world a little bit. And that's when he demanded our family's contact information. And then later that night, my father received a voicemail message on his phone demanding $1.5 million for my life. And Nigel's family received an identical phone call, and neither of our families had anything close to $3 million to bring us home.
And as you look back on it, if you had come from families that did have that kind of resources, do you think this would have been a 2 or 3 day event? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. It was all about money. And actually, I now know kidnappings happen far more commonly than most people know or understand. The year that I was kidnapped, 16 other Canadians were kidnapped that year. Most of it never makes the media because it's resolved very quickly. If your company or your family's in a position to pay, it often happens. It doesn't make the media as it did in my case.
So your story is very dramatically told in stages. The stages when you and Nigel are together, the stage when you're apart, the stage when you convert to Islam, etc. Take us through the stages, say the first week. What was going on in your mind, dealings with the captors, thinking about your parents and your government? What were you thinking those first week? What did you think was going to happen?
I recall really being in a state of shock, trying to adjust to this new this new reality of having absolutely no freedom. And Nigel and I, we really relied on each other during that early period. Nigel had, I think that he himself would say this, a more difficult time initially than I did, and I found myself in the position of almost needing to be strong for both of us, which helped me in many ways. And so I remember us doing things like sitting together and repeating over and over and over again positive affirmations to calm ourselves, like, I choose peace, I choose freedom, repeating statements like that over and over and over again for hours until we were calm.
And tell us about your physical circumstances early on, where you were kept, what kind of conditions, how far away, how you were guarded.
So initially we were kept on the outskirts of Mogadishu, the capital city of Somalia, and we were kept in total in a series of 13 different houses, and they were all abandoned places, some of which had relics of furniture or remnants of the family who had once lived there. But these were all, for the most part, pretty filthy places. And even if there were furniture in the room, when we were brought in, they would move it out. So the rooms that we were always held in were empty spaces, pretty grim, really, usually without electricity.
And you describe very vividly in the book the range of captors and this man you called Donald Trump, who keeps coming in as the paymaster. Tell us about the range of people you were dealing with in this early captivity and how you thought you might approach them or not, how you might be able to deal with them.
Well, there were essentially two groups. There were the boys, as we called them, who were these young, mostly teenagers, the youngest of them being 14 years old, who were our guards, who were in that house with us, or whatever house we were staying in and day out. Essentially, if you think about it, almost hostages with us. They did not have the freedom to come and go. And then there was the group of leaders, who were slightly older Somali men who seemed to be educated, who were definitely in charge of these young boys. And these boys, most of them hadn't been to school. Some of them were orphans. We had one young man in the group, a particularly cruel young man named Abdullah, whose sole goal in life was to strap a bomb onto his body and go into neighboring Ethiopia and kill people. But there were other young men in the group too who wanted a future for themselves, who talked about their hope for the end of war in their country and opportunities for education. That was one thing that was very notable to me, in fact, was hearing many of these young people talk about their desire for an education in a country where most young people just don't get the opportunity for that.
So, as a procedural matter, at what point do you want to start showing some of the images there? When we get to,
I realize we've kind of missed them.
When we get, and I'll tell you what I'm going to be asking you about, just so you'll know. I'm going to ask you about the conversion to Islam. I'm going to ask you about when the situation there became very dark. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you about the way you coped mentally, about your attempted escape, and about, after this was all over, the remarkable things you have done. So that's a sequence of what we're going to do, and you can tell us when you like. Are there pictures we should see now?
Well, we've actually kind of missed a couple. So here's me in my early travels. This is me backpacking in northern Pakistan with my camera. Me embedded with the Canadian troops down in Kandahar, Afghanistan. And some images of Somalia taken in the capital city, Mogadishu. And then Nigel and I in captivity. So that about catches us up.
And who, I forget from the book who took this. This was leaked to Al Jazeera?
Exactly. After the first month in captivity, they did a sort of ransom video, and so this is a screen grab from that video.
So let's talk about your decision that both you and Nigel should convert to Islam, why you thought that was useful, how your captors responded to it, because it's a very major and intriguing part of your book.
Yeah, I had spent enough time in the Middle East prior to going into Somalia to know that if we made the request to convert to Islam, they, as Muslims, would probably feel obligated to allow us. And I was right. We made that request of our captors, and it was on day 11 of our time in captivity that, as a survival strategy, Nigel and I went through the motions of saying the prayer, the Shahada, to become Muslims. And what this gave us was a window into what these young men believed in and how they saw the world. So we were brought a Quran that was English on one side, Arabic on the other, and Nigel and I both read this book over and over and over again. It also gave us insight into, there are passages, ayahs in the Quran, which are pretty explicit about ransoms and hostages and female captives, and we paid particular attention to these verses, and we would use them to have conversations with our captors who believed, unfortunately, that everything they were doing was very much in accordance with Islamic law.
And what was their degree of skepticism about this convenient conversion to Islam? Did their religion require them to take it at face value, or how did they respond?
They seemed to take it initially at face value. They were proud almost of the fact that Nigel and I had made this decision to convert to Islam. They felt like, I think that it scored them some points up there with Allah, in fact, that they had been part of our conversion to Islam.
Right. And yet, describe, if you will, the interesting contradiction among some of the passages of the Quran. Some of them you could cite as ways that you should be protected, especially as a female captive, and some others they cited back as saying that you should not be protected.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, in the Quran, in the time of the Prophet, there were female captives who then became the wives of the Prophet, and so there was a precedent set during the Prophet's life about female captives being property and possessions, and that was unfortunately the experience that I had. Though I would try to argue, I'm your Muslim sister, they would argue back with these particular passages that, well, yes, but you're also a woman in captivity who is our property.
And what there was, a particularly abusive person who was mainly relying on that. Did they all seem to embrace that women in captivity interpretation?
They certainly did later, after everything got so bad.
So I will let you take the lead here of describing the next stages of your captivity, in which you went through really terrible circumstances, of over what time period that happened and how you responded physically and emotionally.
Well, everything really changed when Nigel and I attempted an escape.
Yeah.
So this happened at about the 5-month point in captivity, and Nigel and I had already been separated, but we were able to secretly communicate with each other, and we planned an escape like this. So we escaped out a bathroom window, and it was a bathroom that only Nigel and I used, and the window in this bathroom was sealed with bricks that had been cemented across the front of it. But with a pair of nail clippers that our kidnappers had given us, Nigel and I were able to carve out this crumbling cement that held those bricks in place. The house we were being held in, it was really old and it was poorly constructed. And one afternoon, we were able to jump out a hole that was barely bigger than the size of a basketball.
And you got caught the first time, it wasn't big enough?
Yeah, exactly. So it was our second attempt. We actually got out this hole, and we did this in the afternoon with a plan to go to a nearby mosque where we hoped that we were going to find some help. But we'd made noise when we jumped out that hole, and it didn't take our captors long to realize that we were missing and then to track us to the mosque. So just as Nigel and I were running inside, and this mosque was full of Somali village men who had just finished their middle of the day prayer. They were sitting all on the floor. But as we ran in, and two of our captors ran in behind us with their guns, there didn't seem to be much that anybody really could do to help us.
Except for one heroic woman.
Yeah. This is hard for me to talk about.
And you don't have to if you don't want to. So we can, let's go back again. Before your attempted escape, we're now talking 5 months in. How had you kept yourself sane? How had you kept yourself physically active? You had some routines that you did in captivity to try to keep yourself going.
So we're talking about pre-escape.
Pre-escape.
So pre-escape, after Nigel and I were separated, I would spend my days really walking in circles around the room that I was held in. And I would use my imagination to lift me out of there, and I would imagine all the things that I hoped I'd be able to do with my life if I made it out of Somalia. I remember during that period really using my imagination to help me cope, but I still had the freedom of movement of my body, even if confined just to that room at that point.
I'm curious, do you know the book, The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci, about a man who was a captive in China in, I guess, the 1500s, who spent his captivity imagining in his mind? He invented a memory palace, which is a similar exercise to what you are doing. And during this time, again, pre-escape, Did you assume you would get out eventually? Did you think you were going to die in Somalia? What did you think?
No, I would say pre-escape, I was very hopeful. I was very hopeful. I mean, the truth was I had started to be sexually abused by one of my captors, which was terrible. But my conditions were not yet at the point, day in and day out, where I imagined that I might die in Somalia.
So now we are going, you've made that you and Nigel have whittled away at this window. You've made your attempt to escape, and in a very dramatic and tragic scene, you are brought back by your captors. Tell us as much as you would like about what happened after that.
Right. I do just want to say we stopped because I said it was hard for me, but I think it's important to acknowledge this really amazing woman who risked her life to try to help me that day in the mosque. This woman who was the first woman I had seen in 5 months since the day that I was abducted, and this woman came over to me and she embraced me, and in English she called me her sister. And then she turned to my kidnappers who were standing in a sort of semicircle around me with their guns, and she began pleading with these angry armed men to let me go. And they ended up dragging me by my ankles out across the floor of the mosque. But this incredible woman, she didn't give up, and she threw her body on top of mine, and she was dragged across the floor of the mosque with me until she couldn't hold on to me any longer, and then we were separated. But right before they pulled me out the door of the mosque, I looked back and I saw this woman. She was on the floor, and her hijab had been pulled off, and she was a woman who was my mom's age, who risked everything that day to try to help me. And I don't know still what happened to the woman that day, but for everything that followed, for the 10.5 months that I still had in captivity after that day, I would think about her and her courage, and it helped me because following that day, everything changed. Nigel and I, we were taken to a new house, and I was locked up inside a room that I called the dark house because it was pitch black. And I couldn't move any longer because they had put a thick metal chain around my ankles and secured that with padlocks. I couldn't sit up. I couldn't even lie on my back. I could just lie on my side. At that point, I had really lost everything. I had lost even the things that you think can never be taken away from a person, like the sky, light, laughter, and I thought about my life. I was 27 years old in a pitch black room in Somalia, and I thought about my choices. Like, had I been naive to go into Somalia? Yes, I had. But had I been a bad person in my life? I didn't think so. So I just couldn't understand how that could be my life. I was really in shock at what my life had become. And as time went on, I really had to escape my reality by going up into my mind into a place that I called my house in the sky, which is what I named my book, where I really lived on memory and imagination, where in my mind I could still remember all the beauty of the world that I had experienced, and I could dream about the life that I wanted to go on to live, and that became absolutely crucial to my survival.
You describe in your book some really almost unspeakable hardships you went through during that time, which we don't need to go into now. But what did you make on a human level of these young men who were torturing you?
Well, thank you for asking me that question. As time went on, I began to really understand who these young people were, which are young people that are completely shaped by war and violence. And these were young people. I mean, I heard some of their own stories. Some of them knew a little bit of broken English, like they had learned from listening to the BBC radio, and they liked to practice it. They liked to tell their own stories. And we heard really terrible stories from these young people of what their lives were like. And so you could say that I began to understand that my captors were both the perpetuators of violence, but also the victims of it themselves. And that understanding in captivity, it helped me, because on a daily basis, I needed to be reminded, just for my own sanity, that these people who had abducted me weren't actually monsters, but were human beings with stories of their own, with painful stories of their own. I needed to be reminded of that. And I'm not calling them innocent for anything that they did, but that is actually just the truth. It's the reality. And going to that understanding, it helped me just make sense of everything that was happening.
And during this long, dark, in all senses period, did any of them ever seem to show some human reaction to you, of treating you not as not necessarily a Muslim sister, but just as a human being, and feeling any difficulty about what they were doing to you?
Yeah, I did see that at different times with all of them, actually. Even the most hardened, even that really cruel young man, Abdullah. Just little things, like there'd be a bad period where I'd be abused very intensely, and then there would be small gifts thrown into my room. And you can perceive that how you want, but I know that that was coming from some place of like, they have to live with what they did. And unfortunately for them, they have to live with that for the rest of their life. But there were these moments where I could see remorse and regret, and even moments where I heard words of apology.
And you can tell me if we want to move on to a different topic, but one of the most dramatic parts of your book is during an exceptionally dark time, you are looking down on yourself from a distance, and you're seeing men doing terrible things to a woman. Mm-hmm. And tell us about that, and whether, as you've read about other people who were victims of torture or hardship, whether that's a common phenomenon.
Yeah, I had this really extraordinary experience, I feel like, with the human spirit while I was in captivity. And what you're asking me about is a period where I was tortured for 3 days, where I was tied up and left in this stress position in excruciating pain for almost 3 days. And during this period, I had this extraordinary experience of feeling like I left my body. A psychologist might call this dissociation, but this experience of leaving my body, and I recall very vividly looking down on the 3 people who were on the floor, one of whom was me, and feeling this enormous sense of sadness for all the people in that room. And that's, even to say that now, I feel the emotion of that. I just understood in that moment, with every part of my being, the truth of what I've just said, that those young men are also really, truly the victims of violence, which is how they can create suffering for another human being, which is always how one person can hurt another, because it comes from their own place of suffering. That is just a truth.
And in addition to that psychological reason why they could do that to you, why were they doing it in the logic of kidnapping?
You know what I think happened in captivity, and I'll never know for sure, but after that failed escape attempt, until that point, all of them, with the exception of one, the first young man who had sexually abused me, I believe tried to treat me with a certain level of human decency. Mm-hmm. But after that failed escape attempt, they were so angry. And they really crossed a line in terms of abuse immediately following that. And I think that once they all crossed that line, they needed to continue to dehumanize me for the remainder of my time in captivity, because to do otherwise, they would have had to really look at what they did to me. And so I think that once they crossed that line, they just, they couldn't really come back from it.
So what was going on with your families, with governments, with other intermediaries during all this time after your attempted escape?
So my mother, my dear mom, she was the primary negotiator. So she was being trained by the Canadian government, though they don't pay ransoms. They did everything they could to support my family. So my mother had, at any given time, 2 Canadian police officers who specialized in negotiations with her. So she would receive these phone calls from the communications guy, and she would be coached on what to say. And so they were phone calls usually about ransom demands. And my family was always hoping that to be able to resolve this without the payment of a ransom. Of course, that would have been the easiest, but in this case, with these young men, it was always about money. And so after my parents realized that, they started fundraising, and my mom spent the better part of a year raising money to pay half of what the total cost was going to be to get Nigel and I home. So I say total cost because there was the cost of the ransom, but also the cost of bringing on board a private security company, because our government couldn't pay the ransoms. We need to hire this company to go in and do that, and that was a major expense. And so my family, Nigel's family, started fundraising to pay all of the costs that were going to be involved.
And what did they know or suspect about your circumstances during this period?
They had really little information, actually. I mean, there was speculation about what I may or may not have been going through. There was a lot of rumors coming out of Somalia, but in terms of like real hard information, my parents had very little. There were a couple of times that I was put on the phone with my mother. They were very short phone calls and always scripted on both ends, but usually me pleading for my life, saying to her, "You have 7 days," or something like that. My kidnappers imposed a lot of those sort of false deadlines, but you can imagine the stress for my mom, not knowing how.
And for you.
Yeah, of course, and for me.
So there's two other things I want to ask you about before we open to questions. Tell us how this all ended. How did the deal come together? What were the terms of the deal? How did you get away?
So it was November 25th, 2009. It was day number 460 in captivity. And at that point, I was being held in a sort of animal shed, this filthy storage room, and it was really bleak. And that day, my captors came in to my room with a little saw, and they started sawing off these rusted chains that had been on my ankles for 10 and a half months. And they put me into a truck. Nigel was sat down beside me. We didn't even dare try to speak to each other, and we were driven out into the desert as night was falling with no explanation of what was going to happen. And so I was thinking that the worst was about to happen, that we had been sold to another group because our kidnappers had been threatening us for a long time. And we were eventually put into a truck with men I had never seen before, and it was only when somebody handed me a phone and said, my mother was on the other end, saying to me, "Amanda, you're free," that I understood what was happening. And so my parents and Nigel's family, after coming to an agreement with the kidnappers, they had hired this private security company to fly the money into Somalia in backpacks.
In cash, U.S. cash.
Which they had then taken to, in Somalia they don't have the same type of banking system that we have here. So if you know how a Western Union works, it's very similar to that. So this cash was brought to this sort of Western Union-like kiosk, a hawala as they're called in Somalia. And a middleman who was neutral to both the kidnappers and our families went to this hawala and received a receipt. This middleman then came out into the desert in the middle of the night when this exchange was happening, and when we, the hostages, were then turned over to the private security group, our kidnappers were given this little piece of paper, this receipt, which they then took the next day into the hawala, and they received all of the ransom money. That's actually the logistics of how it worked. And Nigel and I, we were flown out of Somalia and taken to a hospital in Kenya, where I spent about 10 days recovering. I was really quite sick.
And how much money did they bring in cash, and how much did the whole operation cost?
It was just over $600,000 in the end in cash that they brought into the country. It was about the same to pay for the private security company. So in total, it was about $1.2 million split between Nigel Brennan's family and mine.
So the last thing I'll ask you is that after an experience that could engender bitterness, despair, suicide, whatever else, the main message you have taken from this in your book and your foundations is that of forgiveness. Tell us about that.
Well, it's been 4.5 years since I came home from this experience in Somalia, and I've talked a lot about forgiveness and how forgiveness has helped me move forward with my life. Really, more than anything else, it is this choice that I make to forgive that helps me. But forgiving, it's not an easy thing to do, but it's something that I choose every single day, literally before I even get out of bed. I choose it, and I choose it for my own self. And it is something that I started to choose even while I was in captivity. And it's something that I do for myself. It's not something that I feel like I do for them. And this choice that I have made to forgive has really allowed me then to go on and do the work that I now do in the world. I started a nonprofit organization after I came home from Somalia, which I called the Global Enrichment Foundation, which works inside of Somalia and with Somali refugees in Kenya. I've got a couple of pictures here that I can show you of our work. Girls like Ayan, who's 16 and a rape survivor and in one of our programs. Women like Fartoon, who lost half of her leg, and as well as her husband and all 6 of her kids in a mortar blast, but after a $200 business grant, she's supporting herself, selling vegetables in the market. We support some of the country's only sports teams. So these girls here are the Elephants. It's 24 high school age girls, they named themselves, who get together to have fun and to learn teamwork and cooperation and to have some physical fitness. But as the work of the foundation grew, people often ask me if I would ever go back to Somalia because we work with that community. And in 2011, I did decide to go back to Africa. I went to Kenya. And I went to the world's largest refugee camp, which is the Dadaab refugee camp. It's just 80 kilometers from the Somali border. And I'm sure everyone in this room remembers that year, 2011, there was a really devastating famine inside of Somalia. And so while I was in this camp, there were Somali people, about 2,000 of them every day, coming across the border, mostly moms with their kids in search of food. And I wasn't in the camp for famine relief. I was there for an education program that we were creating, but I couldn't stop thinking about these kids, and I was also thinking about the hunger that I myself lived through as a hostage in Somalia, and I felt this sense of responsibility to do whatever I could to help with this situation. And so I started fundraising, and that August of 2011, I went back to Somalia for the first time with a whole bunch of Somali volunteers, and we brought food that day to 14,000 people, but we ultimately gave out over 2 million meals in response to the famine in Somalia. And it's really about the choice that I have made to forgive, that I make every day, that allows me really to step into this work, which for me feels sort of like the purpose of my life now.
And having made that trip back to Somalia, do you imagine you will go there again, to that country?
No, I don't have any plans to go to Somalia right now, but I don't regret going back. I went back with my parents' blessing, with kidnap and ransom insurance, with lots of security, and I made really different choices than I did in 2008, and I'm really proud of what the Global Enrichment Foundation has done. We've raised almost $3 million to reach about 200,000 people.
And forgive me for asking this, but kidnap and ransom insurance? That's what are the terms of the policy?
Well, I actually, if you can believe it, I get kidnap and ransom insurance from the company, the private security company, AKE in London, that came into Somalia and rescued me.
Oh, great. So we have time for a few questions. I know there'll be more than we'll have time for, but who would like to ask Amanda about her story or her book? Yes. Oh, actually, please, the microphone will come.
How did your mother deal with this incredible ordeal? How was she able to deal day by day on
I
her
know,
side?
my dear mother, she's such an incredible person. I mean, she was on the phone dealing with these guys sometimes weekly, sometimes daily, sometimes multiple times a day, my dear mom. And she was so strong, she says, because she needed to be, right? Because her child's life was on the line. And then I came home, and I was really sick. I was really malnourished. You can imagine the state that I was in. And so she was still in mom mode, really taking care of me. But about a year after I came home, when I really started to feel well and to live my own life again, she sort of said, "Are you okay now?" And then she kind of collapsed. And she's had, honestly speaking, a really hard couple of years. She has a lot of stress-related illnesses now because of this period. But my mom is a very spiritual woman, and she believes that she will be healthy one day again, and she's very proactive and working on her recovery from this, so I believe that she's right. Thank you.
Yes, woman here, yes. And then next, at the next table, yes.
I was wondering what happened to Nigel.
Right, Nigel. Well, I actually haven't seen Nigel since we said goodbye in Nairobi at the hospital after we were released from captivity. And we did try to stay in touch afterwards. But Nigel and I, we not only had really different experiences, we're really very different people. And I think we found it hard to connect after our time in captivity. And Nigel has also written a book about his experiences, and I believe he goes around and talks about it. But I have not talked to Nigel in a couple of years, though I wish him well.
Yes, there, and then here.
I'm a psychologist. I work at the VA, actually. We get great press there. I work pretty exclusively with veterans who suffer from PTSD. And first of all, I just wanted to say how inspiring I thought this was to hear this.
You.
And one of the things we look at and we talk about and we study is this idea of resiliency and how it can often help to stem a post-trauma reaction. And you strike me as a very resilient person, and I was wondering if you could maybe put into words how you draw on that resiliency, where that comes from for you.
Thank you. And I should say, yes, I think that I have certainly experienced resiliency and I would call myself a resilient person, but I really struggle as well with PTSD. Of course I do. After everything that I've been through, how could I not? But I think that resiliency is inherent in all of us, but it also requires choice. So it's something you almost need to nurture. Like, it's there, but you need to choose it. And like anything in life, the more you choose something, the easier it becomes. And when I was in captivity, it kind of surprises me looking back that I didn't think more about ending my own life while I was in captivity when times were the bleakest. But I could always tap into this part of myself that believed in the goodness of the world and believed in my own ability to survive. And I think the human spirit has this remarkable capacity and desire to survive. And that's what I experienced. And I think anybody that goes through something really challenging has the opportunity to experience that. But you almost need to focus, and I believe you almost need to focus on it and allow that to rise up and allow it to grow.
And to follow that briefly, would people who knew you 10 years ago, would they recognize you as the same person they knew back before this experience?
I think so. Yeah. I was I'm 33 now, and in my early 20s, I was very much a spiritual seeker. As I was going out into the world, I think I was asking myself a lot of big questions and esoteric questions, but it was only really when I had the experience in captivity that you have the opportunity to look into your toolbox and see, like, what do you have to work with to survive? And I had read all of these books and had these different practices, which I then had the opportunity to use, which has then changed me.
Great. There was a question at this table, I think. Yes, here. So, hold on just a second. Thanks.
Explain that private security agency. You mentioned London. I just picked that up, but
So what is a private security company? Is that the
do
question?
they just do it for anyone, or they like?
These are like mercenary rescuers.
That's what I was
basically?
thinking. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
There are these companies all over the world, and it's actually, I think that they're most of the people who use their services are business travelers, and so as I've said, kidnappings are far more common than you can imagine, and so these type of companies don't actually pay the ransom money, but they facilitate the payment of the ransom. So that's what you get the insurance for. Like in Canada, it's illegal to pay ransoms. You need to hire one of these companies who assume then the responsibility and liability of that to do it. But there are these companies all over. Yeah.
Yes, in the far back, gentleman back there.
Your fascinating story and very moving, so thank you. Your adopting to the Quran, was it simply defensive, or have you carried away some philosophical value and seen some good that has affected your life as you amalgamate your other beliefs today?
Thank you. Honestly speaking, I can't say that I really carry a lot from Islam over into my life now. But with the Global Enrichment Foundation, I work with Muslims every day. I feel very much the same about Islam as I did before my time in captivity. I understand that my kidnappers were practicing a very radical interpretation of their religion.
And it was important to them that you and Nigel had a Christian background, right? Because you were people of the book?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. So, yes, any other questions? We have time, I think, for one more. If there's anybody else who'd like to get in a last question. So I will ask you one, which is, what's the... this book I recommend to all. It's really gripping and powerful, and will rank with the great, survival stories and transcendence stories. What's the main thing you hope people will get from reading your book?
Well, I've always been a reader, and so I hope that this is a really great read for people. My co-author and I worked very hard to write it almost like a novel, so you can tell that there's some dark content to this story, but I think it's very readable. And ultimately, I want people, when they close the book and walk away from it, to be reminded of the strength of the human spirit and its ability to overcome any type of human suffering. I think we all need to be reminded of that.
So with that, please join me in thanking Amanda Lindhout for